Before we dive into one of the most disturbing cases you'll ever hear, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling me if you think evil is born or made. Because after this story, you might never have an answer. Now, let's begin. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September 2021. A woman's voice, barely audible over her own sobbing, told the 911 operator that a child wasn't breathing. The address she gave was a modest single-story home in San Jose, California, tucked into a quiet residential neighborhood where families barbecued on weekends and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Within minutes, paramedics arrived at the scene, their red and blue lights painting the darkness with an eerie glow that would soon become permanent in the memories of everyone who lived on that street. When they rushed inside, they found 3-year-old Aurelie Naomi Proctor lying motionless on the living room floor. Her small body was covered in bruises, some fresh, some days old. Her eyes were partially open, staring at nothing. The paramedics worked frantically, their hands moving with practiced precision, but even before they loaded her tiny form into the ambulance, they knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic fall or a sudden illness. This was something far darker. Aurelie was pronounced dead at the hospital 30 minutes later. The preliminary examination revealed injuries that made even seasoned medical professionals pause. Multiple contusions across her torso, signs of blunt force trauma, and evidence of prolonged physical abuse. But what haunted the emergency room staff wasn't just the injuries themselves. It was the pattern, the deliberate nature, the sheer brutality inflicted upon someone so small, so defenseless. Detective Maria Hernandez caught the case before dawn had even broken. A 12-year veteran of the San Jose Police Department, she'd seen her share of child abuse cases, but nothing prepared her for what she was about to uncover. When she arrived at the home, the scene was chaos. Family members were gathered in clusters, some crying, others staring blankly at the walls. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The initial interviews were confusing, fragmented. Family members gave conflicting accounts of what had happened that night. Some claimed Aurelie had been sick. Others said she'd fallen. But when Detective Hernandez pressed harder, when she looked into their eyes and demanded the truth, a word kept surfacing, whispered like a dark secret. Exorcism. At first, Hernandez thought she'd misheard. Exorcism? In 2021? In suburban California? But as she interviewed more family members separately, the story began to take shape, piece by horrifying piece. According to multiple witnesses, Aurelie's family believed she was possessed by a demon. They claimed she'd been exhibiting strange behavior, speaking in different voices, acting violently, showing unusual strength for a 3-year-old. In their minds, influenced by certain religious beliefs and cultural practices, there was only one explanation. The child had been invaded by an evil spirit. What happened next would become the central horror of this case. On that September night, family members gathered in the living room to perform what they believed was an exorcism. Aurelie's mother, grandfather, and uncle were present, along with several other relatives. They held the little girl down as she cried and screamed. They pressed on her chest, her abdomen, her throat. They believed they were fighting a demon, driving out evil. But what they were actually doing was killing a frightened child who had no way to defend herself, no way to escape the people who were supposed to protect her. The autopsy report would later confirm that Aurelie died from asphyxiation and multiple blunt force injuries sustained during the so-called exorcism. The medical examiner noted that some of the injuries were consistent with being held down with extreme force. The little girl had fought for her life, her small hands bearing defensive wounds, but she never stood a chance against the adults who surrounded her. Detective Hernandez stood in that living room as crime scene technicians photographed every angle, every piece of evidence. She noticed a small pink stuffed rabbit in the corner, a child's drawing on the refrigerator showing a stick figure family holding hands. The contrast between the innocent markers of childhood and the horror that had occurred in this very space made her chest tighten. 3 family members were arrested that morning: Aurelie's mother, Claudia Hernandez, age 25, her grandfather, Rene Trigueros Hernandez, age 59, and her uncle, Jose Angel Trigueros Hernandez, age 19. All three were charged with felony child abuse resulting in death. As they were led away in handcuffs, neighbors gathered on their lawns, shock and disbelief etched across their faces. How could this happen? How could a family kill their own child in the name of God? But the case was about to take an unexpected turn that would shake the foundation of California's justice system. Because what seemed like a clear-cut case of child abuse was about to become something far more complicated, far more controversial. The defense attorneys were preparing a strategy that had never been used in a case like this before, one that would force the courts to confront uncomfortable questions about race, religion, and the law itself. When investigators searched the home more thoroughly, they discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in a bedroom closet, they found journals, religious texts, and handwritten notes detailing the family's beliefs about demons and spiritual warfare. But they also found evidence that would support a defense claim no one saw coming. Because buried in those documents was proof that the family's beliefs, their entire worldview, was deeply rooted in their cultural and religious background. And that discovery would become the foundation for a legal argument that would challenge the very nature of justice. But when they opened the locked basement door, searching for more evidence, what they found changed everything. The basement door hadn't been opened in weeks. When Detective Hernandez descended the narrow wooden stairs, flashlight cutting through the darkness, she expected to find more religious materials, perhaps evidence of previous rituals. What she discovered instead was a makeshift living space that told a story far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The basement was divided into two sections. One side contained a small mattress on the floor, children's clothes folded neatly in cardboard boxes, and drawings taped to the concrete walls. Stick figures with smiling faces. A house with a sun overhead. The innocent artwork of a child who should have had her whole life ahead of her. But it was the other side of the basement that made Hernandez's blood run cold. Arranged against the far wall were dozens of candles, now melted into waxy pools. Religious icons hung from strings attached to exposed pipes. And covering nearly every inch of wall space were photographs. Not of Areli, but of other children. Dozens of them. Some looked similar to Areli, dark-haired and dark-eyed. Others were clearly from different families, different backgrounds. Each photograph had handwritten notes in Spanish scrawled beneath it. The crime scene technician who translated them later that day had to take several breaks, his hands shaking as he typed his report. The notes described symptoms. Speaks in voices not her own. Eyes turn black. Attacks family members. Refuses to eat blessed food. The dates on these notes spanned years, suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident born from a single night of religious fervor. This was a pattern, a belief system that had been developing and spreading through an entire community network. Detective Hernandez immediately expanded the investigation. She contacted Child Protective Services, requesting wellness checks on every child whose photograph appeared in that basement. What she discovered sent shockwaves through the community. While most of the children were safe, living normal lives with families who'd long since abandoned these extreme beliefs, two had died under suspicious circumstances years earlier. Their deaths had been ruled as accidents at the time, explained away by grieving families and overworked investigators who hadn't dug deep enough. The case against Claudia Hernandez, Renee Trigueros Hernandez, and Jose Angel Trigueros Hernandez seemed airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy report, witness statements, the basement shrine, and now connections to other potential victims. The district attorney announced that the state would seek maximum sentences. This was murder disguised as religion, they argued, and the perpetrators deserved no mercy. But 6 months after the arrests, the defense attorneys filed a motion that stunned legal observers across California. They invoked the Racial Justice Act, a groundbreaking law passed in 2020 that prohibited the state from seeking or obtaining a criminal conviction based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. The defense argued that the prosecution of their clients was inherently biased because they criminalized religious and cultural practices specific to their Pentecostal faith and Salvadoran heritage. The motion was over 100 pages long, meticulously researched and argued. It claimed that the family genuinely believed Aurelie was possessed, that their actions, while tragic, were rooted in sincere religious conviction shaped by their cultural background. The defense presented expert testimony from anthropologists and religious scholars who explained that belief in demonic possession and spiritual deliverance was common in certain Central American Pentecostal communities. They argued that the family was being prosecuted not for their actions, but for their beliefs, and that similar cases involving white families and mainstream religions had been treated with far more leniency. The prosecution fired back immediately. They brought in medical experts who testified that no amount of cultural or religious belief justified torturing a child to death. They presented evidence of the injuries Aurelie suffered: fractured ribs, bruising consistent with being choked, signs of prolonged abuse. This wasn't a single moment of misguided faith, they argued. This was systematic torture that lasted hours while a little girl screamed for help. But the defense had done their homework. They compiled data showing that when white families claimed religious reasons for refusing medical treatment or using corporal punishment that resulted in a child's death, they often received lighter sentences or were charged with lesser crimes like negligent homicide instead of murder. They found cases where Christian parents who beat their children as biblical discipline received probation, while immigrant families were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for similar actions rooted in their own religious traditions. The courtroom became a battleground for a larger cultural war. Protesters gathered outside daily, divided into two camps. One side held signs demanding justice for Aurelie, displaying her photograph, a smiling 3-year-old with bright eyes and pigtails. They chanted that no culture, no religion, no belief system justified killing a child. The other side argued that the prosecution was an attack on religious freedom and immigrant communities, that the state was imposing Western, secular values on people whose worldview didn't fit neatly into mainstream American categories. Inside the courtroom, the preliminary hearings revealed details that made both sides uncomfortable. Prosecutors presented evidence that Claudia Hernandez had expressed doubts during the exorcism, had begged the others to stop, but had been overruled by the older male family members who insisted the demon must be cast out. This complicated the narrative of her as a cold-blooded killer, but it also raised disturbing questions about patriarchal control and coercion within the family structure. The defense countered by presenting Claudia's history: a young mother who'd immigrated from El Salvador at age 15, escaping violence and poverty, who'd been raised in a strict religious community that taught her to obey male authority figures without question. They argued she was as much a victim as Aurelie, trapped in a system that gave her no power to protect her daughter, even when every maternal instinct screamed at her to intervene. Detective Hernandez watched from the gallery, her frustration mounting with each hearing. She'd spent months building this case, interviewing witnesses, piecing together Aurelie's final hours. She'd held that little girl's pink stuffed rabbit in her hands and promised to get justice. But now that promise felt like it was slipping away, buried under legal arguments and cultural debates that seemed to forget the most important fact: a 3-year-old was dead, killed by the people who should have loved her most. Then came the bombshell that would fracture the case wide open. A witness emerged, someone who'd been in the house that night, but had been too terrified to come forward initially. Maria Santos, a distant cousin who'd attended the exorcism, finally broke her silence. Her testimony would reveal details that contradicted both the prosecution's narrative of deliberate murder and the defense's claim of sincere religious belief. According to Santos, the exorcism had been planned for days. But it wasn't driven by sudden concern for Aurelie's soul. It was motivated by something far more sinister, something that had nothing to do with demons or faith. And what she told investigators next would expose a conspiracy that reached beyond that single tragic night. Because hidden beneath the claims of religious conviction and cultural tradition was a secret that would turn this entire case inside out. A secret about money, about immigration status, about a deal made in desperation that required Aurelie to disappear. And suddenly, the exorcism looked less like a tragic result of misguided faith and more like the perfect cover for premeditated murder. Maria Santos sat in the interrogation room, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. Detective Hernandez had seen countless witnesses over the years, But something about Santos's fear felt different. This wasn't the nervousness of someone worried about getting in trouble. This was the terror of someone who knew that speaking the truth could destroy her entire world. "They told me it was about the demon," Santos began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But 2 days before the exorcism, I heard Renee and Claudia arguing in the kitchen. I was in the next room, and they didn't know I could hear them." She paused, wiping her eyes. Renee said they had no choice, that the arrangement had been made and they couldn't back out now. Claudia was crying, saying there had to be another way, but he told her it was too late. Detective Hernandez leaned forward. "What arrangement, Maria?" What Santos revealed next sent the investigation in a completely new direction. According to her testimony, Areli wasn't just Claudia's daughter. The child had been born as part of an informal surrogacy arrangement with a wealthy family in El Salvador. Claudia, desperate for money to bring her mother to the United States, had agreed to carry a child for a couple who couldn't conceive. The deal was simple. She'd give birth, hand over the baby, and receive $20,000, enough to pay for her mother's medical treatment and immigration fees. But Claudia had changed her mind after Areli was born. She'd bonded with the baby, refused to give her up, and fled with the child to California, cutting off all contact with the biological father. For 3 years, she'd been hiding, using her grandfather Renee's address, keeping Areli out of schools and medical systems that might create a paper trail. The biological father, a powerful businessman with connections to organized crime in El Salvador, had been searching for them ever since. 6 months before Areli's death, he'd found them. The messages started arriving first as threats, then as demands. He wanted his daughter back, or he wanted his money returned with interest. $60,000. Money the family didn't have. Money they could never get legally. And then the threats escalated. If they didn't comply, he would have them deported, arrested, or worse. Renee had been the one to propose the solution. If Areli died, there would be no child to return, no debt to repay. The man in El Salvador couldn't claim what no longer existed. But it had to look like an accident, or better yet, like something no one could be blamed for. Something beyond human control. The exorcism was the perfect cover story. In their community, death during a spiritual deliverance was seen as God's will, a tragedy, but not a crime. They'd make it look like they were trying to save Areli from demonic possession, and when she died, it would appear to be an unfortunate consequence of battling evil forces. They'd grieve publicly, accept condolences, and the biological father would have no legal standing to pursue them for a child who no longer existed. But they hadn't counted on the autopsy being so thorough. They hadn't anticipated that the medical examiner would document every injury, every indication of prolonged suffering. And they certainly hadn't expected the case to blow up into a national controversy that would attract this level of scrutiny. Armed with Santos's testimony, Detective Hernandez obtained warrants for phone records, financial documents, and international communication logs. What they uncovered was devastating. Text messages between Renee and an intermediary in El Salvador discussing the problem and the permanent solution. Bank records showing desperate attempts to borrow money in the months leading up to Areli's death. And most damning of all, a voice message from Claudia to her mother, sent 3 days before the exorcism, saying, "I can't do this anymore. They're going to make me hurt her. God forgive me, but I don't know how to stop them." The defense's Racial Justice Act motion suddenly looked very different. This wasn't about cultural bias or religious persecution. This was about 3 people who'd conspired to murder a child to escape a financial and legal situation of their own making. The exorcism wasn't a sincere act of faith gone wrong. It was premeditated murder disguised as religious ritual. The prosecution filed an amended complaint, adding conspiracy to commit murder and special circumstances that would make the defendants eligible for life without parole. The defense attorneys scrambled, trying to salvage their case, but the evidence was overwhelming. Jose Angel, the uncle, was the first to crack. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he testified that Renee had orchestrated everything, that he'd convinced the family the exorcism was real while secretly planning to kill Areli all along. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury saw photographs of Aureli's injuries, heard recordings of her final screams captured on a neighbor's security camera, and listened to Maria Santos describe how she'd watched a 3-year-old beg for her life, while adults she trusted held her down. The defense tried to argue that Claudia was coerced, that she was another victim of Renee's manipulation, but the prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Claudia Hernandez had dozens of opportunities to save her daughter, the prosecutor said, displaying a timeline on the courtroom screen. She could have called the police. She could have fled. She could have refused to participate. But instead, she held her own daughter down while that child suffocated. Whatever fear she had of Renee, whatever debt she owed to a man in El Salvador, nothing justifies what she did to Aureli in those final moments. The jury deliberated for 18 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. Renee Trigueros Hernandez received life without parole for first-degree murder. Jose Angel Trigueros Hernandez received 25 years to life for second-degree murder and conspiracy. And Claudia Hernandez, the mother who'd carried Aureli for 9 months and then held her down as she died, received life without parole with no possibility of appeal. The Racial Justice Act motion was denied. The judge ruled that while cultural and religious factors could be considered during sentencing, they could not be used to excuse or justify the torture and murder of a child. The defense immediately announced plans to appeal, setting up a legal battle that would likely reach the California Supreme Court. Outside the courthouse, protesters from both sides faced each other across police barricades. Some held signs demanding harsher immigration enforcement, claiming this case proved that certain cultures were incompatible with American values. Others argued that the prosecution was still an example of systemic racism, that the state had only pursued maximum charges because the defendants were Salvadoran immigrants. But Detective Hernandez, standing apart from the crowds, wasn't thinking about politics or legal precedents. She was thinking about a little girl who'd drawn pictures of smiling families, who'd slept in a basement surrounded by candles and religious icons, who'd spent her last hours on Earth terrified and in pain, crying out for a mother who wouldn't save her. 3 months after the verdicts, Detective Hernandez received a call from the FBI. They'd been investigating the biological father in El Salvador, the man whose demand for his daughter or his money had set this tragedy in motion. During a raid on his compound, agents had found something that made Hernandez's blood run cold: a list of names. 23 women, all Salvadoran, all believed to be in the United States. All had allegedly entered into similar surrogacy arrangements. All had disappeared with the children they'd been paid to deliver. The FBI wanted to know how many of those children were still alive. How many families were living under threats? How many desperate parents might be considering their own permanent solutions to escape debts they couldn't repay? Hernandez opened the file they sent her and stared at the first photograph. A little boy, maybe 4 years old, with the same bright eyes Aureli had in the pictures that covered her refrigerator. Alive for now. But for how long? The case of Aureli Naomi Proctor was closed. The killers were behind bars. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But as Detective Hernandez began making calls, requesting wellness checks, reaching out to immigrant advocacy organizations, she knew the real story was far from over. Because somewhere out there, in quiet houses in quiet neighborhoods where families barbecued on weekends and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, other children were living under the same threats. Other families were making desperate calculations. Other tragedies were waiting to happen. And the most haunting question of all remained unanswered: how many more Aurelis would die before anyone figured out how to stop it? The courtroom had delivered its verdict. The appeals would take years. The legal scholars would debate the Racial Justice Act's applicability for decades. But none of that would bring back a 3-year-old girl who deserved to grow up, who deserved to draw more pictures, who deserved a family that would protect her instead of kill her. In the end, that's what true crime always comes down to, not the legal arguments or the cultural debates, but the victims whose voices were silenced, whose futures were stolen, whose stories become cautionary tales whispered in the darkness. Aureli Naomi Proctor's story was over. But the consequences of her death, the questions it raised, the systems it exposed, those would echo for years to come. And somewhere in another basement, in another house, another child was waiting to see if anyone would save them before it was too late.